In this video tutorial, I'll be teaching you how to make a 10-strand wire copper bracelet. And we're going to fabricate these end caps, and there we're going to fabricate those entirely out of the same wire along with a small piece of sheet material. Here's one done with nickel silver square wire and copper round wire. So you're really only limited by your own imagination in what kind of wire you want to use, as well as the shape of the wire. So copper wire is available in many different gauges. So we're going to be working with both 14 gauge and 18 gauge copper today. And I'll show you what we're going to do as we go along. So this 18 gauge copper, we're going to use this as our twisted area, which will be this portion right in here. We're going to twist those wires. Because I'm using 18 gauge instead of 14 gauge that was used here, I'm going to use 3 strands instead of 2. And this is our 14 gauge wire, and all you have to do is strip off the insulation. You can buy copper wire just as it is. There are so many places online where you can purchase copper wire and you don't have to strip off all of the insulation. I've gone ahead and done that with those pieces there, and I have all of my 18 gauge pieces cut and ready to go. But the first thing we need to do is we need to make a template. And the template's going to be used to help organize and twist your wires and keep everything straight while you're making the final twist for the bracelet. So this is what the template looks like, and you can make this out of wood, you can make this out of plywood, you can make it out of, what else do I want to say? You can make it out of plastic, you can make it out of like a cutting board. The material is stiff and firm, that is not going to be floppy like cardboard. You wouldn't use cardboard, for example. So I just had some scrap acrylic laying around, and I decided I was going to make my circle jig out of that. So this is a divider, and what I'm going to do is we're going to make this 3.5 inches. You can make your circle really any size. I honestly did not make this a particular size. I just made a circle to start with, but for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to make our circle 3.5 inches in diameter. So I've set my dividers at 1 3/4 inches, which is half of 3.5. So I'm going to put one end of the divider down onto the acrylic, and I'm going to bring my other end of my divider around. Just want to make sure I have enough material on all sides. Okay, so push down on the center, and now we're going to turn. While you're holding the center in place, you're turning the material, and we're bringing that scribe along, and that will create a circle. If you don't have a divider, you can use a protractor, and in a pinch you can also use a couple of different sized bowls. Okay, so that's our center portion right there. We need to make a second row of cutout holes again, so I'm going to make another circle a little bit smaller than the first one, and there's your center portion there. And what I'm going to do is bring my divider in, and let me get a measurement on that real quick. You don't want your holes too close to each other. You don't want your first and second row holes too close to each other. That looks good. So I measured this now. This is a 1 inch gap there. So we go back to our center point, put your divider down. Now we're going to turn again, We're going to turn the material again, and we're creating your second circle. If you have a protractor with a pencil on it and you're using wood, you know, your pencil is going to draw your line for you. I like the divider because it has a sharp tip and it will score that nicely. So I need to cut this out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to my mini bandsaw and I'm going to rough cut this circle out. Okay, so I've got this cut out, got a rough circle cut out. Now I'm going to go to my disc sander and I'm going to smooth those edges off. Okay, I'm going to use a little bit of sandpaper and we're going to smooth off any of that, that little bit of fluff that's left. If you don't have a way to cut a circle, you can always do this in square. It does not have to be a circle. What you really need is just something that's going to have some holes in it, that's going to allow for you to hold the wires in place while you're turning them. So it doesn't have... If you don't have a way to cut a circle, you can always do this in square. It does not have to be a circle. What you really need is just something that's going to have some holes in it, that's going to allow for you to hold the wires in place while you're turning them. So it doesn't have to be plexiglass, it doesn't have to be acrylic, and it doesn't have to be round. So work with whatever you have available to you. Okay, so now we have our circle. Now we need to find the center because we're going to create our intersecting line. So this is a circle finder and it works just like this. You put your circular material in the slots there, flip it over, and then you can draw your lines. Now if you want to measure, you know, obviously you're welcome to measure. I pretty much eyeball it, just because it isn't required for this to be exact. You just want to be pretty close with it. This is not anything where you need critical measuring. So I've done one and another one directly across from that. Now I'm going to do like these little pie sections. So you're going to end up with what basically is going to look like a clock. And two more. Okay. So now we need to create holes. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put another line in through here. It's going to help me line up the holes a little bit better. And so I'm going to do that. Let's see how far I'm going to go out on that. Let me measure that. So that's 1 1/4 inches there. So I'm just going to create another line just to help me place the holes for drilling more accurately. Using a center punch, you're going to punch everywhere where the line that you drew along with the lines that you scribed intersect. And this is going to be your drilling points. Okay, and then you want to finish with 1 in the center. Okay, we're going to go ahead and we need to anneal the copper wire that we're working with. It's really important to anneal before you do any twisting. And the reason for that is if you try and twist wire that hasn't been annealed, you're not going to get a consecutive smooth curl. It's going to end up with lumps and gaps, and you've got to anneal in order to get a nice smooth twist on that. So the best way is to bundle everything up. It makes it easier to anneal. Now, this wire here, this 18 gauge wire, according to the package, I believe it said that it was already soft. I don't trust that. I just want to make sure that it is annealed. Because like I said, if it doesn't twist smoothly, then that's basically a wasted piece of wire. So it's better just to go ahead and anneal to start with. So we're going to go over to the jeweler's bench and we're going to anneal this copper. Okay, this is an annealing pan here, and it's on a rotating base, and this is a perfect item to use for annealing. Now we're going to anneal these two bundles separately because this is going to anneal, the 18 gauge is going to anneal quicker than the 14 gauge, so we're going to do them separately. So I not too long ago got this really nice high-powered butane torch, and for annealing this works really fast. So I've been using this instead of my oxy and acetylene soldering system to do the annealing. So you want to get your copper to a dull red. Like I said, with the 18 gauge, it's not going to take long at all. I'm going to quench that, and then I'm going to put it in the pickle pot. Now we're going to do the 14 gauge. I'll put links below the video on where you can purchase that torch head. You can also purchase those butane canisters on Amazon. Okay. So I'm going to get everything out of the pickle pot, get it all dried up, and then we're going to go over and do the twisting. Okay, I've set the 14 gauge aside for the time being. I actually should probably call this a 13 strand bracelet, because instead of doing 2 wires per twist, I'm going to actually do 3 wires per twist, and that's because I'm using a smaller gauge here. The bracelet that I made initially is 10 strands, and that was used completely with 14 gauge wire. So I thought we'd do something just a little bit different this time. So all these are annealed and they're dry. You want to get them straight. They twist better if they don't have a bunch of kinks in them. And you can straighten them out. The 18 gauge is really easy to straighten out by hand, but if you have difficult time straightening them out by hand, you can always use some nylon gel pliers, and that straightens them out really nice as well. So we're going to gather the 3 ends together, and we're going to put that into the vise. Only maybe 1/2 inch or so. And I don't believe I mentioned that I have all of these pieces are 14 inches long. It's best to have your ends even when you put them into the chuck of the drill. That way one doesn't grab and the other one's not grab. Okay, I'm going to open up the jaws of your power drill. You don't have to have a power drill to do this. You can just put everything, you can gather all the wires up together and grab it with a vice grip and then just twist by hand. But as you guys know, I love power tools, and so I try and do just about everything with power tools. So I'm going to twist that chuck, and then just very slowly you're going to pull back and you're going to advance the drill. And you're going to twist it as far as you want. If you want a loose twist, you're going to stop sooner than if you want a tight twist. So really, this is where your creativity comes to play, and you need to decide how tight you want your twist to be. And you'll notice that the wire stiffens up tremendously because you're work hardening at this point. And I think I like it right there. So you're going to do that with the next 6 strands. Okay, I'm using the end that has the smallest amount of waste. So I'm going to go up through the hole to the inside. I'm going to make a loop. I'm going to bring it back down through the hole behind it. Then I'm going to grab a plier. Actually, I don't even need to use a plier because this wire it's annealed and it's nice and soft. So what I've done is just fold it backwards. So when you go to put this into the vise, these wires are not going to come out. Now we're going to skip a hole. We're going to go change wires. Now we're going to use our 14 gauge wire. Go to the inside hole, make a loop, back down, and then fold that tail up. Okay, and now you're just going to keep repeating that process. Skip a hole, thread up through the inside hole, make a loop, down through the outside hole, bend that up. Now your 14 gauge wire. Just keep repeating this process until you've got them all threaded in except for the center one. So at this point you should have your braided ones or your twisted ones opposite or every other space, every other hole from your straight ones. You want to get everything nice and straight. I'm going to back out here. So I'm going to use my nylon pliers, and I'm going to get these all nice and straight. It doesn't, the braided, or the, excuse me, the twisted ones, they're not as easy to do with the nylon pliers, so I'm just going to do these by hand. Okay. You can bundle these together and put tape on it if you like to help hold everything. I've made myself another little jig here, and it's just taking a couple of pieces of wood, and I have put them together into the vise and then drilled down through. So I have like a half hole on either side, one larger one, one smaller one, depending on the thickness of the bracelet that I'm working on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my wires organized as best as I can, and it's about impossible to get it just perfect, but you want to do the best that you can to have your twists be every other wire. Okay, we're not doing the center one just yet. And you want to make sure everything is all taut the same. You don't want one wire loose and the other one's taut. And you're just going to adjust your wires till you get them about as good as you're going to get them. The reason you're making these 14 inches to start with is you're going to have waste, and that's perfectly fine, because you'll find on either end that your twists aren't going to be exact, and those are the areas that you're going to cut off. So you're going to really be more concerned with what shows up in here than what shows up down in here. So like I say, your twists don't have to be perfect down at the bottom and at the top, because that is going to be waste. Okay, got this pretty straight. I'll lay it into my jig here. And I want it up in there pretty far, because I want as much of the material as I can to be used for the bracelet and have a little bit of waste. So I'm going to put this into the vise. And you'll tighten it down. Now, if you find that it's too loose, you might need to drill a different sized hole. Okay. Also, you can fold up your loose pieces at the bottom, your excess pieces at the bottom, to help hold it in place. So now you have a little bit easier time of getting things straight as it's being held in. Okay, now we're going to put the center one in. I find it easier to put the center one in last. Once you've got your outer ones organized, put your center one in last. And it seems to, at least for me, it works better to keep them organized. So I'm going to move it over to here. So the more wires you're dealing with, the more organized you need to be. Okay, I'm going to twist this wire at the top, because I don't have another hole to drop it down into, that's fine. You don't need one. All you need to do is twist that at the top. Okay, I'm going to push it down in there, and I'm going to reach for it as it comes out the bottom, and make sure everything is nice and taut. Okay, so now let me just change the camera angle a little bit so you can see this better. Now you're going to pull up on the jig and you're going to twist at the same time. Make sure all your wires are organized properly, because basically when you start doing this, you really can't go backwards and try and fix things. So pull up and twist, and just keep doing that. And if you see that one looks like it's a little bit loose, you can always pull it a little bit tighter at the top. That one has looked a little bit loose. So being that everything's annealed, it's easy to turn. So you just want to make sure you're always pulling upwards as you twist. And you can twist as much or as little as you want. I think it's important to get a nice tight twist so your wires stay together well, because when you go to cut off your excess, if your twist isn't tight, some of your wires are going to pop loose. Okay, some of these I want to turn a little bit more, and it can become difficult to turn. What you can always do is, if you get it really nice and tight here and you got it too loose down here, you can always pop it out, put it into the vise and put it into the drill, and let the drill turn it a little bit more. But I think that looks just about right. Okay, so like I said, this is, you know, your artistic decision in how much you want to twist this. Okay, take this out, and this is what you're going to have at this point. You're going to cut the wires loose from the jig. All right, now we're going to take this bundle and we're going to use a rubber mallet, and we're going to tap these coils really nice and tight. I am using one of the forming blocks for the bender, and this is the mini pin slot. If you don't own a bender and don't have this available, you can create a slot in a board or a block of wood, just something that's going to cradle your bracelet section and hold it in place while you're going to tap all of this down. You want to tap this down, and that's going to compress all of the coils nice and tight together. Twisting as you go. Turn my hand here. And you can see how that really tightens everything up and compresses it all together. And you really need to do this portion here to make sure all the wires are tight, so when you do cut off your waste on the bottom, that nothing unravels. Okay, and then you want to examine it, make sure everything is nice and tight and no wires are popping up above any of the other wires. If you see anything like that, you're going to want to tap that down. If it becomes too difficult and it is so work hardened that you cannot get it compressed any further, you can always anneal it again. So you're going to measure the bracelet by measuring your wrist. So if you have a 7-inch wrist, you're going to cut a 7-inch piece, because you're going to have a 1/2 inch gap. Because it's a cuff bracelet, you're going to have a 1/2 inch gap that's going to fit perfectly. Okay, I am using the mini bandsaw to cut mine off. I have marked where I want to make my first cut, and then I have marked here where I'm going to make the second cut. So because I want to make sure these are really tight and snug, I'm going to use a little brass hammer. And make sure your little coil end is nice and tight like this. You don't want pieces loose from each other. And try and make that as round as you can, because we're going to be creating the cap for the end, which is round. And obviously it's going to fit much better on there if that is as round as you can get it. Okay, so now we're going to make the jump rings that are going to become the caps on the end. They're going to become the caps on the end. You need 3 for each end. You can do 2, you can do 4, you can do whatever you want. This is again where your creativity comes into play. So this is a little jump ring maker. It's called Easy Jump Rings. It's a very, very simple tool with a few different size mandrels. If you don't have one of these little jump ring makers, you can find something, usually something around in your shop where you can make the jump rings. So how this works is you put the wire in the end and you fold it over. Now I've annealed this wire. So you definitely need to anneal the wire, especially this 14 gauge. If it was the 18 gauge, you probably could get away with not having to anneal it, but you have to anneal it when you're using this heavy stuff. So you're going to fold it down, and now you're going to hold your thumb on the mandrel. And you're supposed to be able to do it with your finger here. I don't find I get enough control. So you want to get them nice and tight. You want to get them tight against the mandrel as well as tight up against one another. Now, I'm sorry, I did not measure that section of wire. I just grabbed a section. And if I have too many, that's fine, because I can use them for other bracelets. I'd rather have too many jump rings than not enough and have to go back and strip another section of wire and anneal and make another coil. You just keep twisting until you have that all the way around the mandrel. Get my nylon pliers, push that last little bit over. So you've work hardened that wire pretty good now. Now you're going to clip it away. These are my Kaiba flush cutters. I love these because they cut really heavy wire just effortlessly. So now we have a little coil. We're going to go over to the jeweler's bench, and using the jeweler's saw, we're going to cut these into jump rings. So what you're going to do is you're going to just advance your saw along the top edge. You don't want to saw all the way down. You don't want to saw this way because you're going to cut through the bottom. You only want to cut through the top of the jump rings, and you want to do those one at a time. Put some beeswax or some sort of lubricant on your saw. Alrighty, I think I have 6 now, and you can see how they will tend to stay on the blade. I think I have one on the floor. Okay, we're going to solder the 6 jump rings that we've made. So you're going to, because you've used a jeweler's saw to make that cut, they fit exactly. So you just want to rock back and to get back and forth. You want to hear that little bit of a click, and you don't want any gap. Solder does not fill gaps. At least in jewelry, it does not fill gaps, because this is not a plumber's solder. You have to have a perfect fit. So you just rock it back and forth till it's closed. We're going to be using hard solder because this is the first process. This is the first soldering process of this project. We start with the solder that melts at the highest temperature. That way any other solderings beyond that, we use a solder that melts at a lower temperature. That way we don't interfere with the soldering that we did to start with and end up breaking that joint open. Okay, doesn't matter if they're a little wobbly right now because we straighten them out afterwards. This is the solder that we sell, where it's already cut and color coded. And the reason it's color coded is because, can you imagine if you dumped this, you had all the containers open and you dumped this, you would never know which solder is which. So we color code them, and we have them already cut to size. So the pieces of solder you need are that big. There really isn't any room there for any more solder. If you use solder, too much solder, then you have big cleanup to do afterwards, which actually in this case is not that important because we're going to be doing a lot of sanding and filing of these jump rings afterwards. We're going to be using Mighty Flux for the soldering. So I'm going to flux the jump rings as well as the solder, and that's to keep them nice and clean. So I'm going to put my jump ring right on top where the join area is, right on top of the piece of solder. It does not matter that the solder has been colored. The color burns off prior to flow, so it does not interfere with the flow of the solder. It's just for convenience, so you know which solder is which. You want your join right over top of that solder. So solder flows in the direction of heat, where our heat is coming from the top. So therefore we want our solder below, and when the heat is at the top, it's going to cause the solder to wick up and fill that joint. This actually goes pretty quickly. I'm using my acetylene. You can use a butane torch for this. And you can see how the solder flows. It causes the jump ring to drop down, and the solder wicks right up. Copper requires more heat than sterling, so you want to make sure that the flow of solder has completely gone all the way up the seam. So you almost have to linger just another moment. And when you do sterling, it's very, very quick, and you want to pull your heat away immediately. Whereas with copper, you need to linger over there, over that section, just a hair longer to make sure you've seen you want to see that shininess of the solder not only flow up the seam, but across the top of the seam. Okay, so it's very, very quick to do those. So I'm going to quench and pickle these, and then we're going to come back and do the next step. Okay, I've got the jump rings out of the pickle. Now we need to make sure that they are flat. So they're a little bit wobbly, and that's because of the cutting, the way they were cut. So we're just going to put it on a steel block here and just tap them down. Tap them down with a rubber mallet. I'm tapping them down with a brass hammer and just doing it very, very gently. Flip them over. Okay, I've got my honeycomb board, and we're going to stack 3 of these jump rings together. And I prefer putting all the seams next to each other. But it doesn't have to be exact. Because like I said, we're going to be doing filing and sanding on these. And I'm going to use some U-pins in my honeycomb board to hold them in a stack. So we're going to solder this little stack together. And I'm going to grab another one and just kind of just stretch it along. Make sure they're all stacked up properly, and stretch it and pin it. And that will keep it in a nice little stack. And check it all the way around, make sure it's all even. And again, you don't have to look for total perfection here, because we will be sanding some of this away. Just want to bring my pins right down on top of my jump rings. Okay, just looks just right. I'm going to put these aside for a moment. We're going to flux that, and what we're going to do, just want to make sure that's holding that top ring down. Kind of wants to slide there. And if things do shift a little bit, you can always move them while the solder is flowed, during the time the solder has flowed. I think what I'll do is I'll just put one more pin there. I think that might stop that little bit of a wiggle on the top there. There, that did it. That third one did it very, very well. Okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use medium solder for this next part. And I'm going to set them down here on my solderite board, my honeycomb board on top of my soldering board. I'm going to set several pieces out, and we are going to do some stick soldering. Always put out more than you want, because sometimes they just disappear on you. And we're going to flux that, and I'm going to grab my solder pick. Okay. I have a little bit of a heat sink with the pins, but not too bad. I'm going to heat up everything up, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat my pick, and then I'm going to heat a piece of solder, and this little piece of solder attaches itself to the pick. So I'm going to heat my jump rings. I'm going to put that little ball of solder next to where a couple of those jump rings join together, and hopefully you can see where the solder flows. And I dropped it. There we go. With all your rings pressed down tight, the solder should flow very nicely all the way around, because you want to fill in all the way around. I want solder all the way around. I don't want gaps. If you find that solder doesn't want to flow, you might want to just press down on your little stack of rings while you're heating. Look all the way around. Make sure you don't have any gaps. If you got a gap, then you're going to put another piece of solder in. Sometimes it can be tricky to pick up on those little balls of solder. Okay, so I've got one down here where I don't have any solder. I'm going to show you an alternate method too on this next stack that some of you might find a little bit easier. Okay, just press down on your little stack. This is copper, so copper is a great way to learn some metal smithing techniques, because you're not gonna melt things as rapidly as you would when you're working with sterling. Okay, got a little bit of a shift on that top one, so I'm just going to put a little more heat to it, and I'm going to tap it back. Okay, and that's it. So let that cool. We're going to quench and pickle that, and then I'm going to show you an alternate method for soldering that second stack. Okay, I'm going to show you an alternate method that you can use for doing this next stack. Okay, I'm going to flux everything. We are going to sweat solder this next stack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up solder chips with my pick, and I'm going to place them on the top of 2 of the rings. So we're going to spread solder on top of 2 of those rings. When your flux turns clear, then you're ready to add some solder to it. So all I'm doing is picking up solder with my pick, and I'm placing it across the top of the jumper. You can see how it's kind of got that silver shininess to it. Okay. And do the same thing here. Okay, so now we're going to take the jump rings and we're going to stack them. If you want to turn off your torch and do that stacking, you can. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of more of the Mighty Flux. Keep those oxides down. And I'm going to stack these in. If you want to stop and you want to cool those, you want to quench those, and you want to set it up again on the honeycomb board, by all means go ahead and do that. I'm going to get this whole stack nice and hot, and then I'm going to press down on the stack. A little bit of a shift there, it's all right, just always push it back. Now I'm going to look all the way around and make sure I have solder flowing all the way around. Okay, and if you don't have solder in one spot, probably just need to press down on your stack, and that will cause the pieces to come closer together so the solder will flow through there. Try not to push just on one side of the stack because it'll make your stack tip. Press down from the top all the way across the top. Okay, and that looks good. Okay, I'm going to quench and pickle, and I'm going to come back for the next step. Okay, got your little stacks of jump rings, and they are now soldered together. One thing I should mention is you need to make sure they fit properly before you solder them into a stack, and I failed to check mine, and mine were too big, so I ended up having to take a little bit out, and then I had to resolder. So I had to cut myself a little chunk out of there and resolder. No big deal. If you find that it's too small, you've made it too small, you can get yourself a bezel mandrel. And put that on there and stretch it. So it's a lot like stretching a ring on a ring mandrel. So now that I have them the proper size, and two, if you need to shape them, you know, if you've got where they're just a little bit misshapen, bezel mandrel, you can get them right back into being nice and round. Okay, so now we're going to solder our little jump rings onto the end of the bracelet. I'm going to put my piece up, and I'm going to use a third hand to hold it there. Okay, just adjust that a little bit. So I'm going to use my third hand to hold it there. So we're going to solder these two pieces together. And what I'm going to do for this is called stick soldering. So these pieces are really tiny, and I feel like I need a little bit more solder than that. It's important to make sure these are nice and tight. These two pieces are tight together, because if you have a big gap in there, first it's going to fall down, and secondly, you're not going to have enough surface connection between the wires on the inside and the wires on the outside, and it's not going to solder together. So I'm going to do what we call stick soldering, and I'm going to use easy solder for this portion. Okay, we're all set up here. Put some flux on. I'm going to flux my solder wire. I am using a piece of easy solder wire, and I'm going to stick solder, which means I'm going to feed the solder in by hand. And I'm going to put the solder in by advancing it just like that. So the metal isn't heated up sufficiently yet to cause the solder to flow. I'm trying to get that one little ball up on the top. Once the metal achieves the proper temperature, the solder will flow, and it will flow down into the wires, between the wires and the jump ring coil that we created. The solder is just starting to flow now. I'm just going to put in a little bit more. This is when I am more generous with the solder than I would be normally. And that's because I just have a lot of surface where there are a lot of gaps. And I want to be sure that I have solder connection between these pieces. It's not easy to make a join in this area, to make a completely flush join, just because of the nature of the piece that you're working on. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the opposite end and get that little end piece, the end jump ring, soldered onto there, and then we'll move on to adding the cap. Okay, now we're going to fabricate the cap that goes on to the end, which creates that domed look. So I've got a Pepe disc cutter here, and I want to choose a punch that is going to pretty closely match up to the diameter on the top here. So that one's a little too small. And that looks pretty good right there. We'll try the next one up. And that one is too large. So for this particular bracelet, we're using a 3/8 inch punch. So I've just got a little piece of scrap copper here. And I'm going to put it in the 3/8 inch punch area. I'm going to make sure it's lined up in there properly. And give a good whack with a hammer. And cut yourself out a disc. And we're going to do that again. I'm going to create one more disc. And we'll put that one right next to it. And a good whack. Okay, so that gives us now 2 little discs. Now we need to put a dome on those discs. So I have a doming block here, and I'm going to choose a hole or a little depression there that's a little bit larger than the disc itself. And I'm going to tap this with a hammer. And it creates the little dome. And we're going to check and make sure it's the proper size. And that actually looks good right there. We're going to take a little bit of this edge down. So if it's just a little bit shy, doesn't come all the way to the edge, that's perfectly fine. We don't have to be concerned about that at all. We are going to be taking some of that down. And we'll make the second disc here into a dome. And we we have 2 discs. I think I'm going to dome those just a tad bit higher. I'm going to put it in one smaller. One just a little bit smaller. Just so I have enough of a domed effect for that little end cap. And that looks good. Okay, so we're going to go back to the jeweler's bench and we're going to solder this cap on. Okay, since we are now at our 4th level of soldering, we're going to be using extra easy solder. And I'm going to add some flux to the inside of these little caps. And if you are curious about the gauge of the metal for the cap, it is 26 gauge. So I'm going to put several pieces of solder in, more than I would normally do, because we want to get the inside of the cap covered in solder, and then we're going to draw the solder down around the edge so it joins with the top of the little jump ring stack that we made. So I'm going to put in several pieces there. And this is a sweat soldering. So I'm going to warm that up slightly so the solder doesn't jump out. And then we're going to let the solder flow in the inside of the cap. Same thing over here. Good. Okay, you don't need to quench because we're going to move right into the next step. Now we're going to add the cap to the top of the one end of the bracelet. So I put some flux there. Actually, I'm going to put a little extra flux on the inside of the cap as well. Never hurts to put a little extra flux on. Now remember, you didn't quench or pickle that, so it's still hot. So don't touch that with your hands. We're going to get it on there as even as we can. We don't want to put our heat directly on the cap at this point. We want to heat from underneath. What we're looking for is a little bit of silver shine. Once that solder flows from the cap down onto the top of your little jump ring set. And you should be able to see that little bit of silver shininess when it comes down. And keep your solder pick handy. You can always tap down to make sure you've got a full connection there. We're working with a lot of copper right now, so it takes time to heat that copper up sufficiently in order for that solder to flow. Okay, I'm going to put some on the top of the cap. Just bring the heat down and around. Watching for that little bit of shine from the solder flow. I'm starting to see some solder flow, and hopefully it will translate in the video there. I'm just tapping it down to make sure the solder has flowed, and we've attached the cap. So you can see this little silver line here, and that tells you that the solder has flowed and is attaching the cap to that little jump ring section. So I'm going to do the opposite end, then we're going to come back. Okay, everything is soldered on, and we are done with the soldering. So if you're happy with the size of the cap, there's no need to do any removal of the material. If you want your cap to be a little more low profile, you can definitely take it down a little bit. So you can use a file to do this, or you can do what I do, and that's use power tools. So let's take this on over to the vertical belt sander, and we'll take that down in a pretty quick manner. Okay, so you can shape your little cap however you want. You can leave it more square, you can dome it, you can leave it more round. You know, really, again, your creativity is going to come into play here. Then I'm going to do a little bit of hand sanding to get that smoother, and then we're going to take that over to the bench buffer. Okay, so some of you may be wondering why we have not shaped this into bracelet form yet. And that's because all of these things that we're doing are so much easier to do when the bracelet is straight. So I've gone ahead and rounded off those caps on the end. Now we're going to use white compound on the bench buffer here, and we're going to get everything nice and smooth and shiny. I'm going to finish up using the red rouge, and then we're going to shape it. Okay, the last thing we need to do is to shape this into a cuff. Because this has been heated, it is fully annealed, and it is actually very soft right now. So we need to work harden it up. Because it is so soft at this time, you don't need to put it on the bender. You can actually just form it by hand. I have a steel bracelet mandrel here, and I'm actually just going to form it by hand. It's quite soft, and I'm just going to give it the shape it needs. And then in order to work harden it, we're going to tap it on the mandrel here. I'm going to put that on a cleaning rag there. And this will work harden it so it's not flimsy. And once it's work hardened, it actually becomes quite strong. It's come quite stiff now, as opposed to the way it was a minute ago. So you want to work harden that till you have achieved the stiffness that it needs to hold its shape. So I've shown 3 different treatments that you can do for this style bracelet. So the caps on the end of this, I did not file them down all of the way, so you see the little dividers in between. So it still kind of more looks like a jump ring or a flat jump ring. On this one here, I used my hammer handpiece to create a diamond texture, and I used the diamond bit on my hammer handpiece. You can get this exact same effect with a $15, $20 engraver and a diamond bit on that. I'll put the link to that below. And on this one here, I made the caps nice and smooth and really satiny and a smooth finish there. So we have all 14 gauge wire. We have 14 gauge copper along with some nickel silver square wire. And then we have the 14 gauge round wire, and that is twisted in with 18 gauge, 3 strands of 18 gauge wire. So you have so many ways to create bracelets out of copper or other materials. And again, as I always say, you're only limited by your own imagination.